The senseless murder of two teenage girls shocked an entire nation. 7 years later, would the girls and their families find justice? This is the Abigail Williams and Liberty German story. Hi, Amy.
Meghan, I know this case.
Yes, I know that you are familiar with this case. And, I thought long and hard about the case I wanted to cover in our first new episode of the year. And in the end, this was kind of a no-brainer for me because this case was very significant to me. And it was resolved at the end of 2024, and I felt like it was time to cover it. For people who might not have initially recognized Abigail and Liberty's names, this is the murder that happened in Delphi, Indiana, or the double murders that happened in Delphi, Indiana in 2017. This case has been requested a number of times, but I definitely felt the need to hold off until there was some resolution. And just last month, as we're recording this, we finally got some resolution in this case. So I think now that we have some answers, and maybe not all, it would be the appropriate time to discuss this story. I'd like to point out that this case involves the murder of two teenage girls. And while for some, the subject matter might be a bit too sensitive, which I'd like to acknowledge that, but be assured as well that we'll be treating the topic with the respect these girls deserve. These girls should have gone from teenagers to young women by now, and their families should have been able to watch them blossom into adults with all the milestones that would have brought. And I really hope that my coverage today captures the impact of Abigail and Liberty's deaths on their families, on their community, and really the entire nation. These two girls will never be forgotten, but for those of you who may not know them, let's meet Abigail and Liberty. Liberty Rose Lynn German, age 14, and Abigail Joyce Williams, age 13, known as Libby and Abby, both lived in Delphi, Indiana in 2017. Delphi is a small farming community of about 3,000 people located about 70 miles northwest of Indianapolis. It's generally considered a safe community where people know each other and don't always lock their doors. It's a small community. Both 8th graders at Delphi Community Middle School, Abby and Libby were the very best of friends. The two both loved art and sports. It was softball for both of them and volleyball for Abby, and the girls both played the saxophone for the school band. Abigail was always smiling and making crafts for someone. She had recently taken up knitting and she loved photography, so she was always taking pictures as well. Liberty loved the sciences and dreamed of becoming a science teacher someday. She was kind and left little post-it notes containing encouraging and loving messages for the people in her life that she loved, which I think is so sweet. Mm-hmm. She liked baking, and she also shared a love of photography with her best friend, Abby. The two were wonderful young girls by all accounts, and they loved being together. And on the night of February 12th, 2017, Abby spent the night at Libby's house for a sleepover. Libby lived with her older sister, father, and grandparents. The next morning, her grandfather made the girls pancakes for breakfast. Always one of the greatest parts of sleepovers, right? Like the big breakfast the next morning with the families. I don't know. I remember these things.
It's funny you say that, though, because when Jordan has a sleepover, they just get cereal. She's always like, make nice breakfast for us. Nope. Sorry.
Wow, cereal. Oh, no. Yeah. I remember the pancake breakfast, bacon, everything, the whole thing. You're going to have to up your game, Amy.
I know.
So on this day, it was an uncharacteristically warm day for February in Delphi. So Libby and Abby decided to do a nature walk. After they got ready, the girls left the house with Libby's sister, Kelsey, Libby's grandmother calling after Libby to take a jacket on her way out since the girls would be outside. Their chosen spot was the Monon High Bridge Trail, a 1.5-mile trail that runs from Old Highway 25 to Deer Creek in Delphi, Indiana. The trail is a straight line, so it's not a loop, and it ends with an unofficial section of the Monon High Bridge, which is a 63-foot high railroad bridge that crosses a ravine. I encourage people to look at this if you haven't already. It's high. For me, I can tell you that I wouldn't be crossing that bridge. It doesn't look like the safest, and I know this is a spot that this is a thing people do, but it certainly is not your standard, I'd say, crossing. Libby's sister dropped the girls off at 1:30 p.m., and the plan was for Libby's father, Derek, to pick the girls up a few hours later after they had walked for a while. But the girls were not at the meeting point at 3:30, and neither girl was answering her phone. And when it began to get dark, the families began to worry and contacted the police. That evening, the entire community mobilized to search, but they couldn't locate Abby and Libby in the dark. Even so, initially they didn't expect foul play.
Meghan, I think you kind of alluded to this, but both girls had cell phones?
Correct, they did.
I'm assuming the cell phones were off, or they have location services. Were they able to track the phones?
Well, you know what? I don't know if they were using location services with their families, to be honest, because it didn't say. I didn't read anything about that. Just that they weren't answering their phones,
Okay.
and I assume if there was location services, they'd be using them.
Of course.
So what I said, though, is that I don't know that anyone expected foul play so much as they thought maybe the girls were lost or maybe one got injured or something happened. But I don't think anyone really expected the outcome here. And it wasn't until the light of day, the next day, which was Valentine's Day, that the girls were found. But it certainly was not what anyone had hoped for. The girls were both dead, and it was obviously a homicide. There was a lot of media buzz about this case, but as we often see, the police were keeping evidence found at the scene quiet. Now, the police have reasons for doing this. Sometimes they release certain evidence, sometimes they keep it all quiet. Usually they don't want to tip off a suspect, or they want to make sure that if there's a confession, it's by the actual perpetrator, and only things that they confess to would be known to the perpetrator, and that's why they keep that information quiet.
Meghan, they were found on the path, and was it just a passerby, or how were they discovered?
They were discovered by searchers, and it wasn't on the path. I will describe where they're found.
Okay.
The path kind of ended, so their bodies were found about a half mile from the path on an adjacent property.
Okay.
Though few details were released about the murders initially, the police quickly released one item, and that was an image taken from a still frame from a video that was found on Libby's phone, and this was of a person they believed to be a suspect in the crime. I'm sure most people remember this. It was a grainy image, but it appeared to show a man with, I'd say, a husky build in light blue jeans, a dark blue jacket, and what looked like a brown hat or cap with possible flaps over the ears. On February 22nd, the police publicized another piece of evidence. So this is a little over a week later. Hoping that someone might recognize a voice, police released audio from Libby's phone that had recorded a man's voice saying, "Guys, down the hill." This was a chilling reveal in the case. Do you remember this, Amy?
Yes. There was a whole podcast called Down the Hill, right?
Yes, there was. By March 1st, there were billboards everywhere with photos of this bridge man, and they were asking for help to find him, and the reward for information about who killed the girls was up to $200,000 at this point. But a few months went by and the police still had no suspects. In a public plea, Libby's mother asked the people of Indiana to install orange lights on their front porches to commemorate the girls, as well as to indicate that the murderer remained at large at that time. On July 17th, 2017, police released the first sketch from an eyewitness in the park that day. The image is of a white man wearing a cap, described as about 180 to 200 pounds, reddish brown hair, who appears in his late 30s or 40s. And with the release of that sketch, many tips came flooding in, along with many possible suspects. One of the first suspects police investigated was the owner of the land on which the girls were ultimately found, adjacent to the park. This suspect was 77-year-old Ron Logan. You had asked before, but the trail ended and their bodies were found some distance from the trail on Mr. Logan's property. Now, Ron Logan had a history of domestic violence, and the tips came flooding in from people who thought he was the guy featured in the bridge pictures and in the voice recording that had been released.
I would imagine if the bodies were found on his property, he was one of the first people that the police investigated, and they probably already vetted him.
I think that they spoke with him, yes. I'm not sure how much. I don't know how much they investigated him. I can tell you that when he was questioned, Logan provided an alibi that seemed to clear him, so that might have been initially what happened. However, that alibi provided by a family member was later dispelled because Logan falsified his alibi, fudging his timeline for his movements the day the girls were killed. He also admitted to the police that he drove to the city or county dump site that day, which was, not initially part of his story.
Mm-hmm.
The police got a search warrant but found no evidence to connect Logan to the crime. And Logan later died in 2022 with questions looming about his possible involvement in the murders. Now, one of the things that you should realize when we look at why he might have lied also about his timeline and whatnot, about driving to the dump that day,
Can I take a guess why he lied?
Yeah.
Because he was doing something else that he shouldn't have been doing. He had something else to hide.
He was on parole or some form of community supervision, and he wasn't supposed to drive. He wasn't supposed to do a couple of things. So the police determined that it was more likely about violations that, he's about something else he wasn't supposed to do.
But that's also a lot of times wrongful convictions start like that because somebody does lie because there's something else going on and that spirals out of control.
I mean, there are people who remain very convinced to this day that Ron Logan was.
Really?
Yes, absolutely. If you read, like the Reddit boards and whatnot, there's people who definitely feel that he was the right suspect. Regardless, a second sketch of the suspect was released in 2019. Now, this sketch looked nothing like the first, with a much younger man who had curly hair. It caused the police to update their description of the suspect they were looking for, now an 18 to 40-year-old.
Oh,
so not
a big difference.
Narrowing things down and very different. The police also released a brief video of the man on the bridge walking. You probably remember this video as well. This was a video version of the stills that had been released previously, but this time they were hoping to get someone who might recognize his walk or the way he moved. I want to point out that if you look at this bridge, the bridge is railway ties and definitely likely would impact someone's walk and possibly change it.
Okay.
So I just want people to keep that in mind because I know, like when I talked about this case with James has a very distinct walk to me, and I would know it anywhere. I would know it without seeing his face or whatnot. So he was the one who said, yes, but remember, as you look at this is not your ordinary bridge, and someone would probably have to adjust the way they were walking on this.
That's true, but I do think mannerisms still remain the same. I know it's a short video, but I think sometimes it's just like someone's mannerisms. But I think that's an interesting point that the gait might change based on where they are.
Okay, so did this work, this released video? Well, shortly after, in 2020, the police would interview another major suspect. You see, Libby had been communicating the evening before the murder on social media with a profile of a young male model named Anthony Schatz. But in reality, Anthony Schatz was 28-year-old Keegan Kline, a sexual predator who had a catfishing scam to chat with underage girls to lure them to send explicit photos of themselves.
I never knew this aspect of the case.
Yes.
I hope they caught this guy. Please tell me.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yes. He lived in Peru, Indiana. I remember reading this going, he lived in Peru, but it was Indiana, which is about 40 miles from Delphi. And it turns out that Keegan had been planning to meet Libby, but according to him, the meet never took place. And especially due to a prior conviction of child exploitation and child pornography, Kline was on the radar of the police. But no connection could be made, as it appeared that he was in Vegas at the time of the murders. And although that video the video that was released of the bridge guy was very grainy, it was very clear that it was not Mr. Kline, because Mr. Kline is a very obese man, or he was at the time. He was entirely too large to be the man on the bridge. But there were other suspects as well. Brad Holder, a local whose son briefly dated Abby, allegedly confessed to his ex-wife that he was involved in these crimes. Holder also reportedly had Facebook posts that oddly mimicked some elements of the crime scene. Like there was a photo image of two girls laid side by side with sticks on them, which I'll discuss in a little bit, was part of that crime scene. And there was an odd post saying the following about real friends. They help you move the body and never speak of it again.
Oh, jeez.
Now, some might say that was a bad joke, but bad timing and, not so funny. Now, Holder's posts were similar to that of a mentally impaired man by the name of Elvis Fields, who lived about 120 miles away in Rushville, Indiana. Fields was also interviewed by the police about the crime after his sister reported that he had confessed to doing something to the girls.
Wow.
So another confession here. At the end of the interview with Mr. Fields, an Indiana state trooper drove him home, at which time he asked the trooper the following. If my spit is found on one of the girls, but I have an explanation for it, would I still be in trouble?
What?
Yes. This
So bizarre.
really happened. He testified to this. Both of these men were reportedly known Odinists. Have you heard of Odinism? If not, let me just briefly explain. It's a pagan religion focused on the worship of the Norse god Odin. So the religion has been associated with white supremacist groups as well. And the reason why it's important is the suggestion here is that the two might have colluded on this crime as part of an Odinist sacrificial ritual, which I will explain when we discuss the evidence at the trial.
Okay.
But hold that thought, because then suddenly, in 2022, a volunteer clerk found a tip that was originally filed incorrectly. Essentially, Amy, we're talking about a clerical error. A man by the name of Richard Allen had self-reported being at the trail the day the girls were murdered. Apparently, his wife had encouraged him to report this to the authorities, knowing that he had been there, and this somehow escaped the authorities until 5 years later.
What? That's a big problem. That's very problematic. It was just filed incorrectly?
Yes, it was filed incorrectly. And had it not been for someone going through, a volunteer going through these tips, I don't know that it would have been found at all, or how long it might have taken. So 52-year-old Richard Allen was local to Delphi, a husband and a father who worked at a CVS in the pharmacy for many years. This was a man with no criminal history of any kind. Richard Allen was brought in for questioning and spoke without a lawyer, denying any involvement in the crime, but acknowledging that he had been on the trail the day Libby and Abby were murdered from about 1:30 to 3:30, which, remember, overlapped the time the girls were there. Police were able to get a search warrant following the interview. When they searched his home, they found a similar jacket to the bridge guy, a cap, and a .40 caliber Sig Sauer handgun.
That consistent with any of the injuries on the victims?
Not the injuries, but the evidence. So
Okay.
You'll see. I'll bring it all together, I promise. Now, this may seem pretty light on evidence, but remember the public still didn't know what the police had found at the crime scene, as you just asked. And in October of 2022, Richard Allen was arrested for the murders of Abigail and Liberty and held without bail until his trial in October 2024.
I'm assuming there's other evidence they have against him. That doesn't seem like a strong case.
I'm going to tell you about it, and I'm glad you're saying that because I think this is the question that people are asking now after the resolution of this case. Due to the case's high profile, there was a lot of activity during the pretrial period. First, in December 2022, Judge Gull issued a gag order until January 2023, so nobody should have been talking to the press. Then Allen's defense attorneys made a motion to move the trial out of Carroll County, which is where Delphi is, based on concerns about juror bias because of the extensive media attention and the highly publicized nature of the case. Then in October of 2023, Judge Gull removed the two defense attorneys, citing gross negligence, and replaced them with new public defenders. Apparently what happened is that crime scene photos had been leaked from their office. A former employee from the attorney's office had secretly taken a photo of the crime scene photos and released it, for which they were criminally charged. Gull claimed that the leak was one of several examples of Baldwin and Rozzi acting with gross negligence. She also accused them of making false statements as justification for her decision. But Ray Allen appealed the attorney's removal to the Indiana Supreme Court, asking the court to do three things: to reinstate the original defense team, to replace Judge Gull for the remainder of the case, and set a speedy trial date within 70 days. How did this work out? Well, the decision to keep Judge Francis Gull was unanimous, but the court was split on whether or not to reinstate Richard Allen's original attorneys. The Indiana Supreme Court did reinstate them, It said that it did so because, quote, the trial court did not find that their disqualification was a necessary last resort after weighing the prejudices to Allen. They did not allow for a speedy trial, saying that Allen's attorneys failed to file the paperwork. This is all happening before. Finally, then, the highly awaited trial commenced on October 18th, 2024. The prosecution opened by saying this case was about three things: the bridge guy, the bullet, and two brutal murders. First, let's begin with the evidence surrounding the two murders. As we know, the girls had gone for a walk along the Monon High Bridge Trail. Along the way, Libby took a photo of Abby crossing the railway bridge and posted it to Snapchat. Most people have seen this photo who are familiar with the case. Shortly after that, something prompted Libby to begin taking the now infamous video of the bridge guy who instructed them to, quote, go down the hill. So, her instincts told her that something was wrong.
Mm-hmm.
He was creepy. They sensed that something was off here. After that, sadly, the girls were murdered. I should point out that the video was taken on the bridge, which was at the very end of the trail. And why this is important, I'm not sure if everyone knows this, but the girls had nowhere to go with the bridge guy behind them because there was no loop. They were at the end, and they would have had to pass by him to return to their drop-off point.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, that's probably the exact moment when they were abducted and taken down the hill across Deer Creek to Ron Logan's property where they were killed. The prosecution then showed the photographs of the girls' bodies at the crime scenes. And this was, of course, very upsetting, but also, in this case, it was very necessary for the trial. Both girls were found lying on the ground just a few feet from each other and about a half a mile upstream from the bridge. They both had huge lacerations on their necks, having had their throats cut by their killer. Abby likely in the spot she was found, but testimony from the state's crime scene reconstructionist indicated that Libby had been mortally wounded about 20 feet away near a tree, and her body was moved to this spot.
Okay.
Libby was nude with her left hand found above her head and her right hand at her side. A lot of blood covering her face and throat, and some blood on at least one of her feet. While Abby laid next to her, dressed in Libby's sweatshirt and jeans.
What?
Her right leg slightly bent with her foot crossed under the left. Her right foot crossed under the left. Both girls with sticks laying across their bodies, and Libby with a large tree limb as well. Abby's clothes were found in a nearby creek. And because you asked before about the gun, between their bodies, an unfired bullet was found. The prosecution's second significant piece of evidence. Okay, so now we move from the brutal murders to the bullet, but it looks like you have a question before I go on.
Is there evidence of sexual assault on both victims or just the one victim?
There's no evidence of sexual assault on either victims. I mean, let me say that. There's no evidence of penetration on either victim.
Okay.
Even though Libby was found without her clothes.
Okay.
Back to the gun. The bullet that was recovered was a .40 caliber. The prosecution argued that this bullet was a match to the caliber of Richard Allen's Sig Sauer handgun, the one they retrieved from that search.
I don't know much about guns, but being a match doesn't mean that it had to have come from that gun, I'm assuming.
No, let me tell you what happened.
Okay.
The state's firearm examiner testified that she compared cartridges fired from Allen's gun to the unspent bullet and concluded that they were a match. Also, it should be noted that somewhere in the video, one of the girls can be heard saying the word gun. So presumably the bridge guy had a gun and they saw it.
Well, that's probably why they complied also when he said down the hill.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think so as well. This was undoubtedly powerful evidence to the jury, and I'll talk about this again. But there was also the analysis of the bridge guy, and that was the third point the prosecution began with in their opening. A witness said that she saw a guy that day in a blue jacket and jeans that were muddy and bloody. So this description of this outfit would be consistent with the grainy footage of the bridge guy from what she saw or reportedly saw. But the question was the bridge guy Richard Allen? According to the state, indeed it was. Remember, we have that voice saying down the hill. So perhaps a voice print could be used for identification. Testimony from a state's police officer indicated that following his analysis, he was able to ascertain that the voice was a match to Richard Allen.
Is that considered real science?
Oh, wait till you hear what the defense is going to say about that. You can ask me then. But it wasn't just that either, Amy, I should point out. It was Allen's own shocking confessions that he was the bridge guy and murderer that the state would offer next.
That's a big one, possibly.
I think this is probably the most significant part of the case. The prosecution originally stated that Allen confessed 61 times while incarcerated to the murders. But from what I understand, talking to someone who sat in on the trial, that number is greatly exaggerated. Truth be told, I don't know exactly how many times it was, but Richard Allen did confess a lot, several times, probably about half that number, and to multiple people.
So a lot of these confessions are when he's sitting in jail, just telling whoever's going to listen, or it's in the interrogation room?
No, in the interrogation room, he initially said he had nothing to do with this. This is after he's been incarcerated in, by the way, I want to point out, solitary confinement for some time.
Did he have a mental health evaluation?
Well, let's talk about that. His treating psychiatrist, Dr. Walla, said that Allen confessed to her that he had in fact committed the crimes. She said that Allen claimed he had intended to sexually assault the girls and led them to a private place off the trail to do so, but he was interrupted by a passing van, so he panicked and cut the girls' throats, then throwing sticks on them to cover them up and fled from the scene. And to support this testimony about the van, a local man, Brad Weber, was brought in to testify that he had crossed that area in his white van around 2:30 p.m. on the day of the murders. More damning were the phone calls that Allen made to his wife and mother, during which time he said that he did it and that he was sorry, despite his wife and mother saying they didn't believe it and they didn't think he did that and they didn't know why he was saying it. But these were phone calls that came from jail after he had spent some time there. And in the end of their case, the prosecution said they had the bullet, the confessions, and a brutal murder, and it all pointed to Richard Allen. So now let's find out what his defense was.
Yeah, this will be the interesting part.
I think so, because I think most of us also knew what the prosecution was going to present, but wanted to see how the defense would refute it. Well, they went for reasonable doubt on every front. So let's start with shoddy police work, according to them. The crime scene was not secured properly. It was trampled on. So that was one of the points they made. The evidence was not all collected properly and processed. There were footprints that weren't processed, and those branches that laid on the girls weren't taken into custody. They were removed.
You mean into evidence?
Taken into evidence, yes. I guess they wouldn't be taking the branches into custody. Thank you, fair. There were no photographs of the bullet at the scene, casting doubt if that bullet was there from the beginning. Remember, you had a ton of law enforcement and people. They said, couldn't someone have dropped it at the scene? Possibly.
Yeah.
Then several key witnesses conducted by the police were lost because they accidentally recorded over them.
Oh,
like
come
with
on.
a DVR, I think.
That's so
No,
embarrassing.
yeah, these were early interviews that were conducted, and according to the defense, they were with potential suspects in the case, so they didn't have those interviews.
That's a big one.
There was also a hair found in Abby's hand that wasn't tested until 2024, and this wasn't Allen's hair, it was her sister's hair, which doesn't change the outcome of the case, but it doesn't bode well for police investigating two double murders that they didn't test a hair found in the girl's hand. So there were some more blunders too, but these were some of the significant ones that the defense pointed to. Next, the defense attacked the other major points presented by the prosecution. The bridge guy, let's start there. Well, nobody ever pointed to Richard Allen. Nobody ever reported that it was Richard Allen on the bridge from the audio or the video or the stills that were released. And that voice analysis that matched so well, this analysis was not performed by an expert, but get this, Amy, by a police officer who heard the audio from the bridge and then listened to hundreds of voice messages of Allen's and concluded it was a match.
Yeah, that's not scientific.
No, that's not scientific.
Did you hear the actual voice? And in your opinion?
Yeah, you hear it, but you can't tell.
Oh, I'm asking you, like, in your opinion, no, you can't. You wouldn't be able to tell.
No, I wouldn't be able to tell.
Okay.
I don't think 4 words. I mean, 4 distinct words might be.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Also, they were not, I don't know how close they were. I don't know what the background noise was.
Yeah.
I couldn't tell. And 4 words is not enough for any type of voice analysis, like a real one, which I don't really know how valid voice analysis is, but I can tell you that listening to hundreds of messages of your suspect and just the
No.
suspect and concluding a match is certainly not scientific.
Nope.
Moving on to the bullet. They call it the magic bullet. Remember, the state's ballistics expert said it was a match. But in her first tests, the expert ejected 6 bullets from Alan's firearm, which makes sense since the bullet found at the crime scene, it was ejected, but it was not fired. But the markings in the lab initially did not match those on the bullet found at the crime scene. So instead, she then decided to fire the bullets. But is this reliable? Are you comparing the same thing? Is this apples to apples? Well, she's comparing rounds that were fired from his gun to a round that was cycled through and not fired.
That doesn't sound scientific.
And no other firearms were tested for comparison, so just this firearm. So the defense used their own expert to point to the lack of scientific standard for this analysis. I mean, we talk about, and we've talked about this definitely in direct appeal, tool mark analysis, which examines rifling from a bullet that's been fired. So a fired bullet will have the grooves from the gun barrel imprinted on it, whereas an ejected bullet will have rifling marks, but it won't contain the physical rifling a fired bullet has. So this is not an exact science by any means.
Well, it could also match his gun, but also match hundreds of other people's guns as well.
That's the exact point, and that's the point the defense made. Okay, so then the defense also presented evidence that cast doubt on the prosecution's timeline of the murders. Libby's phone recorded video at the bridge at 2:13 p.m., but the phone stopped moving around 20 minutes later at 2:32 p.m. The prosecution contends that the girls had been murdered by this time, or right around this time, and that Alan fled the park quickly after the murders. But the defense brought on their own digital expert who testified that Libby's phone was accessed, in that a headphone jack was plugged into the port at 5:45 p.m., just seconds after a phone call came in, and this headphone was later removed at 10:32 p.m. This is really significant. Why? Because it would put a hole in the state's timeline in that they said the girls had to have been deceased by 2:30.
Why couldn't someone else have been using her phone?
It's possible. Yes,
Yeah.
it's definitely possible. But the defense said it's also just as possible that the girls were taken somewhere else and held and that they weren't murdered immediately. It looked like Libby's body was possibly moved to a spot. So what they're saying is that maybe the timeline was wrong. They might have been murdered later in the afternoon or evening. Just couldn't be sure.
Okay.
But that phone certainly being accessed, which the prosecution didn't find, might have been indicative that the timeline was wrong. And if the timeline's wrong, then Alan is not the responsible party because he left the park.
When did the searches occur for the girls? I know you said at first no one was that worried, but did anyone search the areas that they were found in prior to when they were found?
Yeah, the day before they were found. But they started that evening, so several hours after, because the families were looking for themselves. You know, we know that the last picture was taken at 2:13, and there was a couple hours in between when the families notified the police, and then the searches began. So we are talking about several hours.
Okay.
And we don't know what happened then. The expert for the defense also testified that though the phone's health app showed no steps or movement, the phone still could have been on and moving via a vehicle, for example. So it's possible that the phone was still moving and it simply didn't register as such. I don't know about the accuracy of that statement. This is their expert, and I'm sure people would say that's not true.
What about location pings? Wouldn't location be, most cell phones, you could tell by what tower it's pinging off.
Well, remember, the girls were found very close. They didn't go far. So I don't know how helpful the location pings would have been. Okay, finally, the defense addressed what was arguably the strongest evidence, and that's the confessions. Richard Allen's confessions were made under severe duress and after he arguably suffered a massive breakdown, which you asked about earlier. Allen had a history of depression and anxiety, and he was placed in solitary confinement. I don't know if you know this, but for 13 months.
No. 13 months? And then he started confessing how far into that?
Several months in.
You know what it reminds me of?
What?
The Ron Williamson case. Do you know Ron Williamson case?
The name sounds familiar, but I can't think of
I teach it
offhand.
in my wrongful convictions class because he was a man who was, in fact, innocent, and he was eventually exonerated But after he was in solitary, he started, having a lot of mental health issues. And it reminds me of that because it's almost that, somebody after being in solitary for that long, you almost start thinking maybe you did it because your mind is just in such a crazy place.
Oh, absolutely. And during this time, Alan demonstrated extreme behavior that was consistent with psychosis. I don't know if you recall this, but he was banging his head repeatedly into his wall, like seriously. He ate part of his Bible. He washed his face in the toilet, and he consumed his own feces. Yes. So the state psychiatrist, remember that Dr. Walla who testified, stated that these behaviors were not psychotic and that he was malingering or faking it. But the defense experts countered this claim with their own experts saying Alan was clearly psychotic by pointing to the extremity and duration of these behaviors, saying, yes, people can fake things, but they are so extreme and they were so prolonged that it was very obvious he was not faking. I have to say, consuming your own feces probably is consistent with psychosis.
Yeah.
But beyond that, Amy, the defense elicited from Dr. Walla that she's a true crime fan who researched a lot about Richard Allen and the case outside of her work. So not even just her interest, but she also engaged with people posting about the case before and during his treatment. Not good. She also used her personal computer to access the Department of Corrections database as well illegally to gather more information about the case. And ultimately, the defense was able to elicit testimony from her that she occasionally shared information from her research on the case with Richard Allen.
Okay.
Now, this is devastating testimony because the suggestion is that maybe she fed Allen bits of the evidence, which he then used in his confessions.
Yeah, not great.
So it seemed that the defense had done some real damage to the prosecution's case. But would it add up to reasonable doubt for the jury, or would the prosecution's case ultimately prevail? In the end, after a 4-week trial, and on the 4th day of deliberations, the jury found Richard Allen guilty of the murders of Abigail Williams and Liberty German. The emotions were mixed. There was shock, despair, sadness, and relief. The case outcome has divided the public into 2 camps. Those who have grave doubts about Allen's guilt and how the prosecution secured their verdict.
Meghan, what would you say is the overwhelming public opinion?
It is very interesting because I've did a lot of, searching chats and boards and stuff, just because I was curious after. I think it's very mixed.
Really?
There are people who absolutely believe that he is the right man, and there are people who point to all of these other suspects and say, well, why was Richard Allen the guy that they came to? I mean, it seemed like there was more evidence against some of the other suspects in the case. For now, Richard Allen is the convicted murderer in this crime, and he's scheduled to be sentenced on December 20th, which is before this episode will air. He faces up to 130 years in prison for his crimes, and I assume that he'll likely be sentenced to the maximum. So no matter what, we're talking about life in prison here.
Yeah, I definitely think that, this case was so incredibly tragic that, I don't think the court's going to show him any mercy.
I don't think so either, but he'll certainly appeal after he's sentenced, and he may have some significant points with the judicial decisions. Judge Francis Gull made some controversial decisions, including the decision to allow the confessions under duress, the decision not to allow, remember I said that there was 2 eyewitness sketches released?
Yeah.
She didn't allow them at trial.
Why?
So some said that this was a mistake. The defense was trying to show that Allen was not the person consistent with the sketches. And I don't recall what the reasoning was for Judge Gull's decision not to allow the sketches into evidence.
What do you think about the sketches? Do you think they look like him?
Well, they don't look anything like each other, nor do I think they look like Richard Allen. But again, sketches from an eyewitness, maybe they weren't also reliable enough to be admitted. And then there was the decision not to allow the Odinism defense with the alternative suspects, which some say seriously hampered the defense. The defense was trying to show that these crimes were ritualistic based on the crime scene. So the sticks that were placed on the bodies, they look stylized, almost like rune symbols, which have magical associations in Odinism. The positioning of the bodies and the clothing swap was very interesting and different or odd. Neither of these are consistent with a more utilitarian mindset of covering up a crime scene. So the prosecution argued that the sticks were a cover-up. The defense said they weren't covered. They were placed very specifically. Yeah. Richard Allen's fate remains to be seen at this point, but I don't know. I suspect that he might prevail on an appeal on some of these points. And I don't usually say that because I think appeals are very difficult. As for the girls, Abby and Libby, their legacy lives on in Delphi. The Abby and Libby Memorial Park, just 1 mile north of Delphi, was created to honor the girls. Their middle school library was renamed to the Abby and Libby Memorial Library. Their community honors them with vigils, fundraisers, and other events, and I suspect that they always will. And as we've discussed before, Amy, the names of the victims, Abby and Libby, seem to overshadow the name of their convicted murderer. A legacy that I think we always hope for other victims as well, that their names will become more significant. All right, I want to talk about the motives or the causes here. Now, in this case, it would appear that there are 3 possible motives, at least as I see it. There are sexual motivations, a ritual killing, or a thrill kill. The sexual motive is what Allen had confessed to, an attempted sexual assault gone wrong. So that one seems more obvious and is what I think most people thought when discovering that Libby was nude. I see the potential also of a thrill kill here, and this is where the killing is done for the thrill or the excitement. The killer likes the terror experienced by the victims, so it's not a utilitarian crime by any means. They like the adrenaline that comes with stalking and hunting the victims. The kill is not usually, or the murder is not usually the most exciting point for them. It's the lead up to it.
These aren't mutually exclusive, are they?
Well, I can tell you that thrill killers usually do not always, but usually do not sexually assault their victims.
Okay.
So they're not mutually exclusive, but that is usually a defining feature.
Okay.
It's also possible, as the defense suggested, that the murders were ritualistic, meaning that the girls were murdered as a sacrifice to, let's say, a specific deity. They point to the symbols, the staging of the runes, the sticks, and the blood at the crime scene and say that this is more indicative of a ritualistic murder. And while staging is certainly a possibility, staging of a scene also has different motivations. So people stage scenes for various reasons. It could be to confuse investigators, to hide the real motive, to suggest a different perpetrator, to bury evidence, or it could just be because of a fantasy of the perpetrator. So it could be symbolic of a fantasy that a perpetrator has from a movie, a book, a dream. So it could just be personal to the perpetrator. In this case, though, I think this is probably one of the most baffling questions. Why? What was the motive? And did we get it right? Did you see any other alternative possibilities here? And again, this is really just what I see as the most likely of the motives.
The only question that I still have outstanding is one of the girls was found nude and the other wasn't.
Yes.
So it makes me wonder if she was targeted in some way.
Yes.
But it doesn't seem like there's any other evidence to suggest that.
Well, yes, there might be. There was a discussion of the way they were both killed by their throats being slit, but it was clear that Abby, when she was found dressed in Libby's clothes, there was no blood on her, and it seemed to have happened when she was maybe either restrained or unconscious, where it seems that Libby was, let's say, moving. There was much more blood found on her, and her hands, she grabbed her throat. So there has been some suggestion that possibly she was the target, but there was nothing that could ever really be proven in that regard. It's kind of speculation at this point.
So she had some defensive wounds, it sounds like, or it was at least clear that she was fighting back at some point?
She was very conscious of what was at least happening to her. So she attempted to grab her own neck, where it doesn't seem that Abby did. It seemed Abby was likely unconscious at the time.
I mean, I think that's worth giving some attention to. I'm sure investigators went down that path. They're a lot more trained at this than I am. But do you agree that there seems to be something there? Or do you think it just happened to be maybe time or something else happened?
Yeah. I don't know, is the truth. I have considered all those possibilities. You're right, it deserves attention, but I wouldn't know what the real truth is behind that.
Yeah.
Whether it was a time thing or a target thing, or some suggested also that Abby might just have been restrained also, and Libby was not. I think it's just too much speculation for me to be able to say for sure. Yeah. But I think it's a good point. And I think in the end, the question is, did we get it right for the perpetrator? And there's, I would say, a lot of division on this. And here's why I don't know. And I can clearly say that. It's entirely possible that we got the right perpetrator, that Richard Allen is the guy. But I don't believe the evidence points to his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt or beyond all reasonable doubt. I think the circumstantial evidence is on the weak side. And I think it's a problem that the jury didn't hear a lot of things that might have given them pause. I also think the investigative mistakes, the lack of physical evidence, and clear psychological abuse, and many people agree that it was psychological abuse of Allen, make me really question whether or not this was a proper conviction. Your thoughts on that?
I would agree with you. I think that, for at least from what I've heard, I haven't read everything in the trial, but it sounds like there's reasonable doubt here. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with the appeals.
I have to say, I mean, I hope for everyone involved that he is guilty, that we have the correct perpetrator, and that the verdict means for some form of justice for the girls, for everyone whose lives they touched, for their family members. But if this was a mistake, I also hope that it's one that we can remedy. Because not only when we make, as you know, when there's a wrongful conviction, it's not just that Richard Allen's life is destroyed. It's that his family's is. It's that the girls don't get justice. It's that there's another murderer who might commit the crimes again. So I hope for justice in this case in terms of the right perpetrator, but I'm not clear at this point that it's been served.
Yeah, definitely going to keep my eye on this case for sentencing and appeals.
Oh, well, I think the sentencing is a foregone conclusion, but I am very curious to see how the appeals work out. I'm very curious to hear what our audience thinks about this case. And one of the things I said that I did take away was the legacy of the two girls. I always hear the way they were discussed and remembered and smiled, and the photographs. And so I think the legacy of the victims here is something that I take away, and I hope others will as well.
And Meghan, I'm glad you brought this case to our attention, because as someone who considers myself, very open-minded and I like to get the information, from what I knew about this case, I thought there was no doubt that he was guilty, and I thought the evidence was ironclad, just by the way the media has reported. So whether he's guilty or not guilty, I think it just shows us, sometimes the objectivity of the evidence is lost with public opinion. So thank you.
I agree, Amy. Okay. Well, thank you, Amy, and thank you to everyone for joining us on this new episode of the new year. And we hope to catch you next time on Women in Crime. Women in Crime is written and hosted by Meghan Sachs and Amy Shlosberg. Our producer is James Varga. Script editing is by Abigail Belcastro. Audio editing is by Siler Burr and Jose Alfonso. And music is by Desert Media. If you enjoy the show, please remember to follow and leave a review. You can also support the show through Patreon, where you can get access to additional ad-free content such as exclusive full-length episodes, lectures, a book club, and virtual happy hours with Meghan and Amy. For more information, visit patreon.com/womenandcrime. Sources for today's episode include articles from Journal and Courier, an episode of 2020, IndyStar.com, CNN.com, the defense motion to admit evidence of Odinism and third-party suspects, Fox59.com, Delphi Murders Inside the Crime Podcast, www.alltrails.com, WRTV.com, and www.wndu.com.